Hello, this is the RPG Crawler, and it is time, yet again, for another product review. This time I'll be taking a look at another offering from Black Oath Entertainment, a sci-fi survival-style tabletop role-playing game by the name of Across a Thousand Dead Worlds, which the developer was kind enough to send me a review PDF of. Across a Thousand Dead Worlds is currently available as a PDF as of this recording, and offers a fully realized system that supports group and solo play, group with or without a GM, with survival and horror elements, procedural generation of sites and planets, adversaries, and more. As always, I'm going to give a brief overview of the PDF's presentation, summarize the contents, and then go over my thoughts on the system at the end. But before I get into it, I'd like to take a moment to mention ongoing channel sponsor World Anvil. World Anvil is a set of tools to help gamers, authors, and other creatives with world-building tasks. It has templates for articles on characters, locations, and lore, interactive maps and timelines through the Chronicle system, organizational charts, and random tables. There is support for over 45 role-playing game systems with homebrew support. Role-playing gamers will find it easier to organize, track, and share lore and information within the group. All of the tools used for world building for gaming can also be used by authors and other creatives to build plot and story events, and even monetize their world by offering exclusive access to articles, stories, and more. World Anvil has a few pricing tiers suited for different needs, and right now you can get 40% off of any yearly subscription by using coupon code RPGCrawler when you sign up with my link. With that, let's take a look at the presentation. Across a Thousand Dead Worlds clocks in at just under 450 pages, 446, with a full-color cover and full-color interior, single-column text with inline tables, artwork, and diagrams where necessary. Rules write-ups are very rarely interspersed with in-character commentary, but more regularly with sidebars that show examples of the rules in question. A bit of the content's art style is reminiscent of one might expect of old school computer terminals, which fits well with the setting, but also oddly enough helps with the readability in some instances, and I'll get into that later. As far as contents goes, there are 7 main chapters, as well as a set of sample scenarios and a glossary. Chapter 1, Welcome to Karam Station, serves as a sort of introduction to the setting. The Character Creation chapter goes over character creation, of course. The Rules chapter deals with the basic rules needed to handle the most common occurrences in the game, while playing the game details generating and running missions, sites, and planets. Chapter 5, Running the Game, is a bit more abstract and covers GM emulation and the various methods of handling arcs. Antagonist covers creating antagonists during play, but also covers a number of pre-made arrangements. Karam Station goes into detail over the setting, specifically the aforementioned station and its environs, but also details supplies, gear, and equipment. The book closes out with 2 scenarios ready to play, as well as a glossary of terms. In more detail, Chapter 1 presents an in-character introduction to the setting, as if the reader is a newly recruited potential diver. It does a decent job of introducing one of the themes of the setting and the general principles of play. Basically, in a future some centuries to come, humanity has headed into space and discovered a series of ancient ships from an unknown civilization. These ships allow travel to distant and uncharted regions of space, where small teams of people known as divers venture to salvage what information, materials, and artifacts they can. They then return these to Karam Station with their findings. Character creation begins with an overview of the character sheet before going through the process of creating a diver. There are 6 primary attributes, which are then covered in turn. These should be familiar to anyone with experience with RPGs in general: strength, dexterity, constitution, will, intelligence, and charisma. They are generated through assigning points from a pool and will range from 8 to 18 to start. There's a brief mention of a basic method of attribute tests, a d20 plus a relevant attribute versus a flat target number, then secondary attributes are mentioned. There's a luck statistic that can be expended and recovers over time. Stamina is expended to perform actions in combat. Stress builds up over the course of multiple adventures and can impact a character once it reaches certain levels. Then there are wounds, which are used instead of hit points. A character can only take 3 wounds before death. There's a small example of character creation up to this point. Skills are covered next, with a brief touch on how to make skill checks before covering each skill in turn. Characters get a pool of points to assign to their skills, up to 10 in any skill to begin with, and skills range from combat skills to knowledge and other tasks. Talents are separate and a sort of mix of feats and class features from other systems. Characters can have a maximum of 5, start with 1, and gain 1 each level. They may be replaced or simply discarded when characters level up, and each talent is described ranging from special attacks and abilities to various flat bonuses. Notably, the level up talent is determined by a random roll, so the decision on whether to accept it or not when a talent cap is reached can be interesting. A choice or a random background roll tells the character what they were before they became a diver, which gives mods to certain abilities. The life-changing event table tells what set them on that path. You can determine how a character earned their chance to be a diver, pick up what sort of goal drives them to keep up with such a dangerous vocation, and so on. Mannerisms help to flesh out role-playing, while the nervous tick table is kind of an indication of what the character starts to manifest when stress starts to build up. There are a few final details, such as starting Drake coins and character cosmetic details. The chapter closes with details on advancement. You earn experience by turning in material found on expeditions. Every 1,000 points you earn a level, and that level gives you a talent and can let you boost skills or attributes according to their own schedules. Chapter 3 covers the rules and begins with an overview of the theme of the game before diving into a more detailed explanation of attribute and skill checks. Again, each one is just a d20 roll with relevant attribute or skill versus a target number. There's guidelines performing non-skill based actions, as well as assisting with checks for a flat bonus. Opposed checks are just a roll high while succeeding kind of test and are used in a variety of rules later on, especially the combat rules. Across 1,000 Dead Worlds does use a d20 style advantage/disadvantage mechanic as well. There's some difficulty modifiers that can be used for different difficulties of checks, and both critical successes and failures, natural 1s and natural 20s, as well as success level guidelines for checks that may have different gradients of success. Gear slots are covered next. Across 1,000 Dead Worlds uses both a slot system to track equipped gear as well as an abstracting gear into the number of slots they take as a form of encumbrance system. Characters are limited on the amount that they can stash in their backpack and pockets and what they can equip into each other slot. This may seem somewhat video gamey, and it's one of several systems that seems video gamey to me, but it does tend to balance things and streamline things to keep track of items. The combat rules then start with a brief intro, then ways to actually avoid combat. Before it even begins, if you're stealthy, you can avoid it, and there's a basic reaction system to give a chance for non-hostile encounters. Then the combat setup is gone into, and it's important since this system actually uses a sort of random combat map generation system. The combat sequence is covered. Characters can move and then expend stamina to perform actions in a manner similar to what actions points do in, say, Fallout. Now, it doesn't use a hit point system, as I mentioned, but rather a wound system, and we'll get into that when the time comes. Combat does take place on a hex grid. There's one available, and there's a set of randomized cover placement tables that can allow for different battle maps each time. Characters are then placed, and there's a roll for surprise as necessary. Surprised creatures get a penalty to initiative, and there's a table to determine what an NPC or creature might have been doing when the characters come across them. Initiative is rolled once and then cycled through in the same order, although you can modify it in certain ways during the combat. Stamina regenerates each round, and different types of attack and actions cost different stamina. Again, this almost gives a sort of Fallout feel to combat. There's an optional combat stance rule that modifies various rolls in initiative. Rules for moving give limits to movement, but basically characters can only move once during their turn. The rules for combat resolution are then covered, and it starts with a contested check, either weapon skills for melee or range versus dex for ranged. In melee, the higher check deals damage, so you can actually receive damage even if it's your attack. You just do get a bonus on the attack, while range simply registers as a miss if you lose. At this point, you roll on the hit location table, which can modify the damage done, and then roll damage. Damage is compared to the target's constitution, and if it exceeds the constitution, then that target is knocked down, or if they're already knocked down, then they are wounded. Being knocked down limits a character until they can get up with a successful check. Characters can only take 3 wounds before dying. Enemy combat is similar but simplified, and enemies are given scripts and attack routines that are performed according to dice rolls each round, giving them a sort of script to follow. Defensive maneuvers and armor can be used to reduce damage, thus reducing the chance of a wound or knockdown, with armor being able to be sacrificed entirely on a section in order to avoid a successful wound even after reduction. There are line-of-sight considerations for ranged weaponry, grenade scattering for, well, thrown weapons like grenades, rules for area of effect blasts of a few sorts, along with template diagrams if you need them. The critical hit and miss rules follow, with critical hits dealing an automatic knockdown or wound, while critical misses require rolling on a table according to the attack type. Suppressive fire and overwatch rules are given for use with firearms and other ranged weapons, while flanking and desperate attacks can be used to modify melee attacks. There's consideration for disengaging and escaping combat, and then a decent example of combat closes the main combat section out, although there are optional rules such as combat events to spice up combat, and lingering damage to make it easier to wound things with high AC. Otherwise, since the damage doesn't carry over in a core rule, you could keep failing to bypass their constitution and then taking rounds and rounds to actually hit them. Anyway, the wounds and injuries section, or the wounds and healing section, covers injuries from being wounded, which can result in long-term penalties depending on the type of wound. There's the rules for treating wounds with skills and supplies, as well as handling wounds obtained out of combat. There's also guidelines for zone-based combat if you don't want to deal with the whole hex map kind of thing in your game and prefer to use things like Theater of Mind. This does tend to simplify some rules, but it's actually fairly well developed and pretty well adapted. There's mention of stealth, which mostly affects how combat begins, and then various conditions the characters can acquire through different attacks, or even environmental effects, some of which may have their own tables of effects, such as parasites or poisons. The stress system represents a sort of accumulation of stress across expeditions and starts with various things that can raise stress, how to use resolve checks in order to lower stress gain, as well as various levels of stress and what they do. It starts simple by manifesting the character's nervous tic, but then can proceed to penalties, negative reactions, and the accumulation of trauma. Negative reactions are usually temporary events, while obsessions and trauma are more long-lasting penalties. Talents, which are gained at each level, of course, can be used to buy off these negative traits from trauma if you start accumulating ones you really don't want. Now, there are miscellaneous rules to close out the chapter. Hacking gives guidelines for trying to access the various ancient machines. Emotions are an optional rule that keeps track of a character's emotional state across a matrix and can be useful with the stress rules. Chapter 4, Playing the Game, more focuses on general gameplay. It starts with a sort of structured gameplay sequence where characters select a starship that determines their team size, select gear, and then go out on a journey, exploring a site, and then returning to the station. These steps are then covered in detail, with the pre- and post-mission activities covered up front. Spaceships are given very basic stats, which basically determines the crew size, supply, and gear slots that can limit the amount of cargo and supplies that can not only be taken but also brought back, along with a random name generator to tell ships of the same designation apart and to give you a sense of ownership when you actually go to play. The travel rules are then gone into and are somewhat abstracted. Characters can travel to a known destination or an unknown one, with an unknown one being effectively a new randomized area, although the duration of the journey is not known up front, which can present certain supply risks. Equipment is then selected with a menu of them available to start, and then the actual rules of a dive are given. The expedition times are determined by whether a site is being returned to, which takes the same amount of time as it did before, or whether it's a new site or one explored by others, where it's randomized or semi-randomized. The duration is measured in weeks, and there are events that can happen each week, some of which can drastically prolong a trip or even spell disaster. Many tables are given, and this can drastically affect the availability of supplies, to the point where you may arrive at your destination with not enough supplies to make it back with a full crew, so you're pretty much gonna know that somebody's not gonna make it back. Once the ship arrives, a roll is made on a table, which can have a variety of outcomes, including the instant loss of the ship and all aboard in rare instances. Mostly, though, this just determines the site and what needs to be generated. There's guidelines for rationing, which can be necessary on some trips, then tracking time once you get into sites, with time costs listed for various common actions. Rules for generating a site follow, including general details and name, its original purpose, what happened to it, its general descriptions, and how active it is, as well as any known threats. Sites can have a dominant site hazard that impacts what you need to explore it, and then there's procedures for generating the site's areas and resources in order to then explore it. This includes connections between areas and events that can happen while exploring. The encounter generation rules are given next, starting with determining the difficulty. There's a variable combat encounter difficulty that can be added on top of that. This portion refers you to the later Antagonist Chapter. Resource generation follows, initially defining what sorts of valuables the KSA, the organization that sends divers out, are looking for. Guidelines for scavenging and then backtracking through a site are given, as well as more details covering a random artifact. These describe the physical appearance and the value of an artifact, as well as the potential effects it has when it's interacted with. The Site Hazard Manifestation table gives additional site hazard events that can impact an exploration while locking access points serves as a sort of locked door and trapped doors kind of thing during an expedition, with various ways to bypass them and various ill effects they can inflict. Dread events can occur that impact an individual and may effectively hamper the entire group, and automatic security measures more serve the same role as room traps in a more dungeon crawly style of game. Fixed events are examples of events that can happen upon exploration and may be replaced if a group comes up against the same ones too many times. There's tables for random occurrences during exploration, as well as descriptors of situations that can crop up that can be elaborated on by a GM. This is followed by an example of constructing and exploring a site, which is very useful. The section for planetary exploration follows, with a general set of tables to determine the core details of a planet, such as atmosphere and the like, and the landing site basically determines what biome the exploration takes place in. Each biome not only has its own major effect on exploration, but is covered under its own set of tables in a moment. There's also determinations of how many encounters a biome has, and known threats just like in a site generation. Planet exploration takes place on a hex grid with tables to generate what's in each hex, what can be found within it, what sites might be present, and any encounters. Each biome is then gone into in turn, basically covering tables for sites and encounters appropriate to that particular biome, with terrain such as barren, frozen, irradiated, lush, scorched, etc. Chapter 5, Running the Game, basically concentrates on GM tools and ways to play without a GM. It starts with guidelines for designing a mission, how to ensure people have fun, including mention of the X card style rules and veiling uncomfortable content. Now, I'm normally not a fan of this sort of thing, as I prefer to play with people that I know well enough and whose limits I understand in and out, so as to not require this sort of thing. But I can see where they can come in handy for a group that you don't have an understanding of, or it's a new group, or just a pickup group. I will give credit where it's due. They even mentioned something similar to that when presenting these systems. Anyway, back to this particular review, the Game Master Emulation System is gone into next, and introduces a basic procedure where you can determine twists in the story, a basic yes-no oracle system, various complication events, as well as an example of GM-less play. Surprise events are generally detailed, as well as tables for general NPC behavior, knowledge, and attitude, as a GM won't be on hand to determine this, although of course a GM can actually use these tables when not certain of an NPC's actions. There's even a morale system given for use with NPCs, as well as tables for their motivations and other details, all the way up to random conversations some NPCs might be having when you come upon them. Guidelines for storytelling aspects such as story arcs are given, as well as flashbacks, as well as a sidebar on failing forward, which is useful when you're dealing with a no DM kind of situation, so that you don't basically soft lock yourself in a particular thing. There is an action and theme table set, like in many Black Oath products, to give general descriptions for inspiration, and then a random action determination table that's used for events that have no real skill or other existing resolution to tie them to, but still require some sort of randomization. The Antagonist Section gives rules and guidelines for crafting an antagonist from a series of tables, including their challenge level, creature types, appropriate numbers of creatures for particular crew sizes, then the creature's qualities, size, movement, and what drives it to act, its intelligence, stats, and role, which itself is similar to a template that modifies basic stats and gives its combat behavior. Enemy abilities are given to grant an enemy special attacks. Then there's tables to randomly generate its appearance and its name. Guardians are handled a little bit differently. These are generated from existing types that are already pre-built, although some may be modified based on the difficulty or other factors. Each of these types is then described with a description, stats for various difficulties, and special abilities. There are actually a decent number of pages worth of these creatures, so even though they are known, so to speak, they still have quite a bit of variation. After these guardian creatures, there is a mention of a Vimonic tech, although the exact details are covered later, and the chapter closes out with enemy morale rules. The Karam Station chapter is more of a setting primer and gives details on Earth in the future. The establishment of Karum and Drake Industries, the construction of Karam Station, discovery and study of the ancient Arsaith technology, talk of human technology, and then the physical descriptions of the place and the services within Karam Station, as well as downtime activities that can take place between expeditions, Its general layout, news, rumors, etc. There's living expenses for longer-term play, information on medical insurance, again for longer-term play, random NPC generation, so you can generate NPC crew members to fill gaps in a crew, and then gear availability, including experimental gear. So the general field guides on equipment follow, with a section detailing weapons, each getting its description, cost, range, damage, gear slots, and any special traits. These range from melee to advanced firearms and explosives. Armor and protective gear are then covered, and they're detailed in a similar manner, with cost, gear slots when unequipped, armor rating, and any other special notes given. General gear is described thereafter, although these entries pay more attention to what gear actually does, and any special rules. Experimental gear goes into more details over these sorts of special rules because of its nature. And then there's a set of actual biomechanical augmentations, which are kind of cybernetics or bio-augmentations, that may grant bonuses and special abilities. Vimonic tech is similar to this. This is basically tech based on material retrieved from the ancient ruins. It's just even more advanced and really only given out to valuable characters. Finally, the book closes out with 2 fully realized scenarios. Reigns of Felonus, which explores a planet, and then the Archive of Minds, which gives you a site. These can be run as is, or use an example of how to set up a scenario using the rules in this book prior, and it covers both of the types of scenario that can be generated, so there is that. There's a general glossary of some terms at the end, of course, just so you know what you're talking about. So, what do I think about Across a Thousand Dead Worlds? Well, I definitely have some thoughts on this one, especially its presentation and structure. So let's take a look at that first one. The artwork and overall design is stylized, but very consistent throughout, and does an outstanding job of portraying a dreary sci-fi setting in the not-too-distant future. I've already commented on how the system terminal-style choice of fonts and layouts in some section actually makes the content surprisingly easy to reference. This is especially true in terms of tables and sections where ranges of numbers are referenced, which is due to the nature of the system. Its plethora of random tables is actually rather often, and I think it's just because I'm used to looking at actual computer code and having it color-coded by various IDEs that I use, that I kind of got used to this pretty quick. Across a Thousand Dead Worlds also has a fairly larger page count than I'm used to with Black Oath Entertainment games, and I must say that these pages are well spent. Although the writing is very clean, well edited, and actually succinct, it is actually a remarkably beginner-friendly as well, with things explained and referenced in a clear and concise manner that doesn't assume a general familiarity with RPG tropes. These examples, given in line, are also very handy for learning particular rules, although I will admit that some of the more esoteric and optional tables may still be a little bit mystifying to a newer player. Some of the writing, especially at the beginning, walks the line between being in-character introduction and being purely rules explanation, and I think that works for this particular product, but I like to see a little bit more delineation between the two. That's just me, though. I think that's just a nitpick from me. So presentation-wise, I'm actually rather impressed with it. I have said in another product review that covering Black Oath releases has been an exercise in watching incremental improvements over time in this regard, and Across a Thousand Dead Worlds fits that progression rather well. As far as the setting goes, this sort of cosmic horror / survival horror stylings of a grim setting where brave individuals set out on unknown alien technology is a little bit of a return to form for Black Oath's products, and while I am on record time and again saying that sci-fi is not my cup of tea most times, I can certainly appreciate the sort of hostile universe presented to the divers as they set out from Karam Station. I also like how this is done while retaining a sense of exploration and adventure, keeping Across a Thousand Dead Worlds from being absolutely grimdark and letting a little spark of hope set in. As for the system, once again, it's a bit of a hybrid between classic and new. The existence of the 6 attributes that one might be familiar with from D20 based material is helpful to those of us with experience in such systems, and I believe that the basic resolution system is different enough from the standard D20 fare that it actually has its own sort of identity. The advancement system is nice and very simple, although I will admit that the randomization of available talents at each level mostly appeals to me because of my background in computer role-playing games, and is one of many things, from the slot-based equipment system to the randomized site generation, that gives the whole system a sort of tabletop roguelike feel. I do realize this may limit its appeal in some circles, but I, for one, rather enjoy it. I will say that I'm not entirely sold on the combat system. The core combat system, as is, seems like it might be a little awkward in some instances, and while the lingering damage rule does much to alleviate the potential for unfortunately protected combat against defensive-style creatures, I feel like it might lend itself to a bit of a spiky combat result in some instances. Now, I haven't actually run enough test combats with it nor examined the math behind it in depth to really verify it. This is just the impression I'm getting, and I may be mistaken. Still, I thought it was worth mentioning. I'm also not sold on the random site generation used in this system either. It gets the job done, of course, but I can't help but think that some other Black Oath offerings may have done a better job with less. Almost every game I've covered from them has some sort of slightly different method to generate random dungeons and ruins, and that's actually pretty common with solo games. I understand that this particular system is actually more tweaked to a full party of players with a GM, but I feel like it could stand to be tweaked a little bit and make it a little bit more well-rounded on the actual construction of randomized dungeons. Now, before I wrap up, I will give special mention to the creature and antagonist generation system. They use a sort of templated and randomized role system to generate different types of creatures, and that goes far in terms of presenting creatures from untold numbers of alien worlds. It just makes more sense than a set of bestiary in this instance, and I've seen like galactic spanning sort of role-playing games where you had like maybe 30 creatures across what was supposed to be thousands of planets. This will keep players guessing anytime they do face off against a new creature in a new site, and provide ample opportunity to really challenge them. In closing, Across 1,000 Dead Worlds is a solid choice for group-based gaming in a dark but still adventurous sci-fi setting, preserving just enough lethality and potential for terrible ends, as well as horror elements to make for a hostile universe, and yet also just enough reward and hope to keep things from going completely grim. I think it does fall down a little bit more for solo RP unless you're used to such systems, although it requires far less adjustment for something that is not designed than something that's not designed with solo gaming in mind. They're constantly walking back and forth between group and solo on these releases, and I think, sometimes you get one that's better on groups, sometimes you get one that's better on solo. I think this one particularly leans more towards better on groups, although it can be used for solo play. All in all, I think it's an easy pickup if you've already enjoyed prior offerings from Black Oath, but want that sci-fi mix that you may not find in, say, Sacrifice or Riftbreakers. And if you haven't used one of their systems before, well, it is actually certainly very beginner-friendly, as I mentioned, so it's not a bad place to start. It's not going to hold your hand the whole way, but it's more beginner-friendly than some independent RPGs I've covered, and that's nothing to sneeze at. It'll be interesting to see some of the expansions for this system, as I have a feeling it'll merit them going forward. In fact, I think there's already one out. I'm not entirely certain on that. I'll have to take a look. On that note, I will wrap things up here, though. This has been the RPG Crawler with my review of Across 1,000 Dead Worlds. As always, I'll put up a link where you can pick it up below. If you like what you've seen, remember to leave a like, comment, got any feedback, and subscribe for more RPG content. Until next time, take care and goodbye. And if you are still watching, I would like to take the opportunity to thank my supporters, the top tiers of which are listed on the screen, without whose support I would not have been able to offer the variety of content that I have on this channel throughout the years. If you're feeling particularly generous and would like to join them, you can support the channel. There are a variety of options to do so. I have a Patreon, a Subscribestar, as well as channel memberships enabled. If you are not in a position to contribute, simply leaving a like, a comment, or sharing my videos are all wonderful ways to help the channel grow without spending a dime, and are all greatly appreciated.